Okay, hello, welcome back. Let's make some work out of our After Effects motion graphics by getting a handle on some refined motion. If you have this After Effects file that I prepared for class called Motion Refined, you'll see that there are 4 folders set up. The first one is called Chair, and it has a comp inside of it called Start and Stop. I'm going to talk about a few basic principles of keyframes here, and then that's going to allow us to move forward with a little bit more adventure down the realms of how we can make things move through time and space and make it more believable, perhaps behaving more accurately to how things behave in our physical world. Physics is a big keyword in all of this. The very first thing I want to talk about is hold keyframes. So we have a chair, and the chair is currently anchored on the left. If I want to initiate the keyframing experience in motion, i.e. just position along the X and Y axis, I'm going to use the position attribute. If I want to find the position attribute, I'm going to press P on my keyboard. It's going to open up position. This isolates just that attribute, so I don't have to see all the other junk in there. So P for position. I'm going to start the keyframing process by clicking on the stopwatch. I can also do that by a shortcut key by doing Option P for position. So if I hold down Option or Alt on a PC and hit the letter P on the keyboard, it instantly lays down a keyframe that is recording its current location wherever my playhead is. So if I now move the playhead to 5 seconds at the end of my comp and just move this thing, you'll see that there's the path that this chair will travel along. And if I were to hold down Shift, it'll keep it constrained on a perfect X-axis. So it'll just slide right across the screen. Now these keyframes are just your old plain old regular keyframes. That means that from frame 0 to frame 429, this chair will travel at an equal rate until it lands at its resting stop, the final keyframe. One thing that I can do is I can use a keyframe assistant to change the nature of my keyframes. So I'm going to select the very first keyframe just by clicking on it in my timeline. I'm going to go to the animation menu, and you'll see that there is something called keyframe assistance, keyframe velocity, keyframe interpolation, and toggle hold keyframe. Why did I go backwards? Because we're going to spend most of our time here in this submenu. Easy ease in, and easy ease out. But just for the time being, I'm talking about hold keyframes, and that is this very first one in the second category here. Categories being here's the first, here's the second, third, fourth, and fifth. Toggle hold keyframe. So a hold keyframe turns the visible nature of this little keyframe in the timeline into something that looks like a diamond on one side and a square on the other. And what it's going to do is going to hold that position until told to do anything else for that value, which is the very end, which is to be over here. So I can have popping, like, the chair just appear magically over on the other side by choosing hold keyframes. Right now, it's going to hold this position all of the 4 seconds and 29 frames until we get to the very end, and it pops over there. But maybe what I'll do is I'll just move this keyframe to like halfway to the timeline, and we'll see that the chair will hold and then pop over to the side, and it now lives over there. If I was to change the location of my chair now to somewhere in between, you'll notice, I'll just kind of go down a little bit so we can actually see this better. It lays down a new keyframe because we're recording. That's what the stopwatch means. We're recording information. So as I move my playhead to 4 seconds and I move the position, it automatically records that position but something happens. It says, all right, well, we're going to lay down another keyframe, a normal one. Since the last keyframe was told to be a normal, we only told the first one to be a hold. We didn't tell all of them to be holds. So this new keyframe is a standard keyframe. We also notice something about the arc of the path, and that is that we have a keyframe that has a handle. See this handle? And that is dealing with the nature of the curve of how this chair will move. I hit undo. Let me just see what happens. It's going to hold, and then boom, it kind of swoops over. You got to get used to this little automatic Bezier thing happening because it's a default setting that we can turn off, but I'm not going to deal with it now. But you need to know that if I hit I just delete this keyframe, how about that? And I go back and I move this thing over to the middle, holding down Shift, the chair should move straight across on the perfect x-axis, land here, and then move back on that x-axis, and it shouldn't deter from the y. But since the Bezier happens naturally, once you start moving objects after keyframes are already laid down, you got to keep this in mind because sometimes you don't even see it. It's like this. And it feels right because you're like, oh yeah, that's all the same line. But if you watch what happens, it pops and then it goes to the right and then to the left again. You're like, well, I didn't make it go to the right, I just made it go to the left. And that's where our good old Convert Vertex tool comes in handy, and you're going to come over and you're going to click on those points that end up giving you handles to remove them as long as you don't want them. So now it pops over and then just moves directly to the left without some weird extra movement going on. If you're going to be a good motion designer or a good motion graphic artist, they're the same thing. I don't know why I say them both. You need to know that that annoying keyframe Bezier is going to happen, and you need to look for it. Otherwise, your work will look sloppy and not tight and finessed until you specifically need it to happen. Then you'll let it happen and maybe even work with that Bezier more to your advantage. But generally it happens, people go, I don't know why my thing keeps moving to the right, I don't have a keyframe over there, I just want it to move to the left. You have to remember that After Effects loves auto Bezier, and that is the nature of After Effects. Okay, so we've got a hold position, a regular keyframe, and then it moves. That movement happens because these are not hold keyframes at the end. As soon as I select both of those and go to my animation toggle hold keyframe, it turns them all into hold keyframes, and my chair will go pop, pop. So now we see movement happening without the actual tweening or progress of movement between the keyframes. This comes in really handy for doing certain specific graphics. Certain specific, two words I didn't need to say together, certain graphics. Like you'll see in a future video dealing with track mats, we'll make boxes kind of pop and move, and it adds a really cool characteristic to your animation as opposed to seeing the actual movement or growth occur. So hold keyframes are awesome. I'm going to get rid of them. How do you get rid of them or turn them back into regular keyframes? You hold down the Command key and you click on those keyframes that you had established as hold keyframes, and now the movement will happen as you would normally think keyframes to behave. I'm going to get rid of all of them by clicking on the stopwatch so that we start over from scratch. Because now I want to talk about acceleration and deceleration. This chair, if it were existing in your office right now and you grabbed it and kicked it, it's going to change from its stationary state to an accelerated state, flying across the room and then come to a rest. Just like a car, you're stopped at a stoplight, you hit the gas when the light turns green, hopefully, and your car will change from being a stationary object to an accelerating object. And then when it comes to the next stop sign or stop light, you need to slow down and then come to a stop. And that is how most things move in nature, especially when they are human caused. So this chair, we're going to kick it across the room. And if I record my position now by hitting the stopwatch, I'm saying, yeah, okay, let's start over here on the left, and by 5 seconds, let's move all the way over to the other side. I'm holding down shift so that it maintains a lateral movement, and this is the result after I RAM preview it. It is constant movement. It doesn't accelerate and doesn't decelerate. It just says, I'm moving, and then that's it. So that's the nature of standard keyframes. You have laid down 2 keyframes, and you've told After Effects you want this object to move from so-and-so position to this new position. And it's just going to do it. It's going to be motorized movement. Very accurately consistent. Well, things don't really move in nature under this principle. Things have acceleration and deceleration, usually because of the nature of gravity is what's making it either slow down or excel or struggle to move. So if we were to look at some options of what we have for our keyframes assistance beyond hold keyframe, this first one, if I select it and I go to our animation menu, keyframe assistant, I see that there are 3 options highlighted or available: easy ease in, and easy ease out. This is the important stuff. I'm not going to use this menu right now, because what I want to do is I want to show you that you can just right click on those keyframes and the menu pops up. There it is down there, keyframe assistant, easy ease in, easy ease out. They also have function key shortcuts to them. So easy ease, what is easy ease? Easy ease is the application of acceleration and deceleration in any attribute, not just position, but it could be scale, rotation, opacity. Anything that's keyframed can be eased in and out of some sort of information. In this case, what we're dealing with is our first keyframe. And if you think about time leaving that keyframe, it's like going out the door of this keyframe's house. That's how I like to explain to my students. We are leaving the keyframe. And then as we see this last keyframe, we are coming into that keyframe's house. And that's how I try to make sense out of what easy ease in, come on, pen, tool, right click, there we go. Easy ease in versus out. So this first keyframe, time is leaving that keyframe, which means we are leaving the house. We are going out the door. So if I choose easy ease out, it changes the physical appearance of that keyframe to be a diamond on the left and then sort of a curved, almost hourglass-like shape on the right. If I watch this with a RAM preview, the nature of movement is different. It actually starts at 0 movement and accelerates into movement in which we find consistent to roll into the end. But this chair, if it's being pushed across the room, is going to accelerate and decelerate. So now I need to address my end keyframe. This last keyframe, time is coming into its house, which means that I should choose the keyframe assistant of easy ease in. Now, the nature of that keyframe is that the hourglass shape is on the left and the normal keyframe shape is on the right. So I have basically put like a parentheses almost in time between these 2 movements. If I look at this RAM preview now, it's going to speed up and then it's going to slow down and come to a stop. Now this is movement that is much more real and recognizable to us as humans. It's relying on physics. It's succumbing to the weight of itself to the terms of gravity. This speed up and speed down is relevant to the amount of time that you're assigning the movement to happen. Currently, we're having it happen over 5 seconds. But if I moved halfway through this comp to 2.5 seconds, that means 2 seconds and 15 frames, and I move that last keyframe to here, hold shift and it'll snap to it, and I watch this movement. That means that that movement will be a little faster because it's happening over a shorter amount of time, and the chair speeds up and slows down and is done moving in 2.5 seconds. So this speed change is an acceleration and a deceleration based on the concepts of easy ease. So let's look at this in another example. Let's go to the prop comp. The prop comp has a prop that I made. It's a Photoshop file, and we're going to deal with rotation. And what I'd like you to do is follow me, please, through this. If you're not following me through these exercises, you're not learning as much as you could. If you're just watching them, boy, I don't know how you could learn anything just by watching. You learn something. But if you're not playing in After Effects as you watch along, then you're missing out on some good learning time. So hitting start and stop is your best buddy. I don't know why I should remind you that, because you should already know that. This prop, I have rotation active, and I just access that by hitting R. So there's rotation in my timeline. At frame 0, I'm going to initiate the rotation attribute of the animation. And I'm going to go halfway down my comp to 215. I'm going to tell this to rotate 3 times. And if you look at the rotation information, there are 2 values here. One of them is how many degrees would you like to rotate, which is the right value, and the left is how many revolutions. So if I want this thing to spin 3 times, I'm just going to click on the first 0, type in 3, hit return, and I am now spinning. Oh gosh, motion blur's on. Turn that off. You're not ready for that yet. We're now spinning 3 full revolutions in 2.5 seconds. And then at the very end, I'd like to go back to 0. So I put my timeline my playhead at the end of the timeline, and I click 0. And now I have 3 keyframes. One at 0, halfway down at 3 revolutions, and then at the end 0 again, which means I'm going to be spinning clockwise for the first half, and then counterclockwise for the second half. If we watch this in a RAM preview, we're spinning forward, and then it just automatically turns and spins backwards. So you would rarely ever see this drastic immediate change in something mechanical or whatever like this. If it was really a good machine, maybe it could do it. But you would expect it to propel itself forward, sort of slow down to neutral, and then accelerate in the opposite direction. That would make more sense, at least if our propeller is operated by a rubber band, which all of my airplanes run on rubber bands. So do my kids. Okay. Now, my kids don't run on rubber bands, but their airplanes do. So let's look at the nature of easing through these keyframes. Our first keyframe, we are leaving in time. So what we can do is we can choose from the keyframe assistant menu, easy ease out. We're leaving it. But now we're posed with this question of a keyframe that exists in the middle with animation before and after it. So what the proper setting is in a case like this is not easy ease out or in, but just general easy ease. That puts the curve on both sides, which means we're going to sort of settle into this rotation degree and then accelerate back into the new information. And then as we get to the very end, obviously we're coming into this last keyframe, so I need to easy ease into it. And if I watch this animation now, it definitely feels much more natural. We have an acceleration, a deceleration, and then acceleration and deceleration again. So it's sort of a back and forth kind of feel. And since it's looping my RAM preview, it feels even cooler. So here we see the nature of acceleration and deceleration and keyframing to be quite logical. You should have no problem wrapping your head around this. What I say at this point to all of my students is that from here on out, anything you move you should question yourself, would it be better if it had easing? And no matter how many times I say that to my students, they don't seem to answer that question in their own heads, because I still get a lot of stuff turned in that is very jerky and mechanical, and it feels awkward. There are times for jerky and mechanical, but for the most part, anything that slides in, slides out, comes to a rest, grows, changes value, it's much better executed if you use this application of easing. It's kind of a no-brainer. So what's actually happening here, and how could we see it besides just these tiny little keyframes? I'm glad you asked. We have a certain perspective that we can look at here in our timeline known as a graph editor. So if we want to activate the graph editor, it's a button right here in the timeline next to all these other buttons that I've sort of avoided so far. But the graph editor, if you open it up, whatever keyframe you have selected, it's going to show that thing. You can also guarantee that you're going to see this attribute by going to the rotation or whatever it is that you're looking at in your graph editor and clicking the little guy right next to it, which will guarantee that, hey, we're going to look at this in the graph editor. So here we see a slope up to a gradual ease on this like hill, and then a slope down to a gradual ease at this next location. This graph editor is showing us the progress of the value of rotation over time. So here we have a 0 representing the degrees. So the degrees is on the the y axis of this scale, and then time is on the x. So if you clicked on your first keyframe, you should see that it has a handle. This handle is the default handle that is given to an eased keyframe, but you can mess with it however you want. You can slope it straight at a diagonal, which means that you would not have any ease whatsoever, or you could bring it back down and just make it longer, which means that it's going to take longer to accelerate to get to a speed in which it hits its final point here at the middle, where it's going to reverse its direction and then speed up towards the end. So I could also grab this last keyframe and say, well, let's do the same thing. Let's just stretch it out over time this way. And so I steepen the curve. By steepening the curve, what I end up seeing as a result, if I do a RAM preview, is that it will take longer for the propeller to reach speed and then longer to settle. Could I address the middle one too? You bet. I could click on that. I could extend this slope outwards so that it speeds up and slows down and speeds up and slows down at a greater interval. So that means the motion in between is going to be even faster. What we end up seeing with our own eyes is that this thing's like blinking. And things don't blink really in our organic existence. Things tend to blur. And that's where the motion blur comes in. So I'm just going to put my playhead kind of in the middle of its spin cycle. And I'm going to look at these little buttons up by the graph editor, one of which is enabling motion blur for the entire comp. Has a few circles. And that means that any layer that has motion blur enabled will be motion blurred. If I look at the switches next to the propeller layer, there's a bunch of different little boxes that I can click on. One of them has a box directly below that little multiple circle deal that looks just like the motion blur guy. If I click on that, then you see that your propeller has now been blurred in a way which means the greater distance something travels over the short amount of time, it's going to have a greater blur. So if I look at my RAM preview now, obviously RAM preview takes a bit longer because it's trying to render this blur out for every frame because it's changing as it speeds up. As it reaches the fastest point, the blur will be greatest, and then as it starts to slow back down again, the blur will shorten and we'll end up having a bit more visibility of those blades as they come to a rest. They finally come to a rest. They're going to reach the fulcrum and then go in the opposite direction. And as they speed up, the blur is greater. Now notice the blur is greater at the ends of the blades. That's because they're traveling a greater distance over the same amount of time as the blade's inner regions. So After Effects is very good at trying to mimic reality and physics in the way we interpret movement. So then as we slow down, those blurs get shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. We come to a rest, and now as we watch it, it looks totally awesome. That is cool movement. I mean, it feels like you're actually looking at a propeller on an airplane, and it's blurred. It's not just bouncing and chopping around. You believe the movement is absolutely real. So then, now comes another point when I tell all my students, motion blur is critical in almost everything that we do, and it should be activated before your final render. Why would I say before your final render? Because obviously it's kind of a render hog while I'm working, and that's why it's nice to say, okay, well, cool, looks great, let's just turn it off for this comp. That way, After Effects doesn't have to worry about rendering it until I actually make a movie. But right before I make a movie, I go say, okay, this comp needs to be motion blurred, so now every layer inside this comp will be blurred if I've told the specific layers to be blurred. And remember, there's a big difference between the individual layer and the comp itself. And then you're golden. So there is easing and motion blur and hold frames or keyframes. And now what we're going to do, I'm going to wrap this movie up so that there's not so much movie for you to watch all the time. And we're going to come back on the next one. We're going to look at the basketball and the yo-yo and just kind of follow up on some of these principles, and they get a little bit more elaborate too. So it's just good stuff. All right, thanks.